So, John, today the book of Proverbs, really actually one of the best known and most often quoted, it's very quotable, of the biblical books, feels like chapter upon chapter of just two-line pithy expressions, though there is more to it than that, and we'll get into it. I guess I would start there with the structure of the book. It's not just a list of proverbs from beginning to end. It's got some different sort of stuff at the beginning, some different sort of stuff at the end, and a bunch of divisions in the middle that I think in many ways attest to its sort of growth over time. You want to walk us through some of those sections?
Yeah, the first 9 chapters are the obvious first division, where you have longer speeches. And then there are, as you say, a couple of chapters at the end that are different in kind, and we'll get back to those later. But in between then you have a number of different collections of proverbs. And in the Greek translation, these appear in different order. So obviously it didn't much matter what the order was. You know, some people have tried to impose a kind of modern literary perspective on biblical books, which would attach great importance to the order things are put in. That doesn't hold for Proverbs.
It reminds me of the Woody Allen piece where he does a postmodern reading of his shopping list, right? So I agree. The Greek order being different suggests not only that the order doesn't matter, but also that it wasn't set in stone, right? That this is probably a relatively late collection, the book of Proverbs as a whole.
And it probably went through several editions, if you like, of collections. The book in its final form, most people would assume was put together after the exile. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a section in it that is said to be the Proverbs that the men of Hezekiah collected. Now, that suggests that he actually sent people around to collect some material, and that would go with the idea that he wanted some material to train his scribes.
Right, Hezekiah sort of being a time of great sort of flourishing, literary flourishing overall.
Yeah.
But obviously there's also the connection with Solomon, and there's also a whole bunch of other figures that are invoked as there's Lemuel
at the end of the book you have the words of Agur, and the words of King Lemuel. No, my son, no son of my womb, do not give your strength to women. Now, so these are bits of wisdom, sayings that impressed people and that got collected together. Not all of them especially religious.
In fact, very few of the actual individual, what we think of as proverbs, the proverbs part in the middle, after chapters 1 through 9, really very little that we would think of as religious, in part because God is invoked. When God is invoked, it's very abstractly, right? Sort of, the God's path, or the right way. Yeah. We certainly don't have any reference to the law giving or to ritual. I mean, the things that really take up so much of the space elsewhere.
Let's just look at a couple of examples. This is one that I always like to highlight in class. When you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what you have before you. Put a knife to your throat if you have a big appetite. Do not desire the ruler's delicacy. They are deceptive food. Do not eat the bread of the stingy. Do not desire their delicacies, for like a hair in the throat, so are they. Now, okay, you never hear that read in church or in synagogue, I suppose.
Nope.
Maybe you should. This is all part of the education of the young. You want them to know how to behave when they go out into the world. Is this also ethics?
It is hard to, right? Yeah. It's hard to imagine. I mean, there is obviously there are ethical implications to some of it.
Yeah.
Not all of it, but it's also hard to imagine a parent actually saying that to a child. This is
Well, you must have had such reticent parents.
It's not the style that I grew up in. But it does seem that these are sort of again, for scribal purposes, it's common concepts elevated stylistically, right? To give scribes practice in sort of higher forms of speech to an extent.
But, you know, if you ask then what kind of ethical dimension there is to this, I would say it's strictly practical.
Right. And not only is it practical, but it is always errs on the side of caution.
Of caution.
Right.
A nice one, never go surety for another. Why should your bed be taken from under you? Now, you'll also get juxtaposed with that, you know, go to the help of your neighbor in need.
Yeah.
God will punish you if you don't. But when you get down to it, you know, don't sign anything.
Right. Yeah. No,
you could get caught.
It is. Right. It's all look before you leap. Right. That's sort of the central theme for so much of it. Why is that a sensible sort of ethical stance for the book to take? Is there is there something in the culture? Is there something in the historical period? Why do they never say, right, like, you know, he who hesitates is lost, right?
Well, you know, they will say that, but then they will say in the next line, look before you leap.
Right. So, I mean, there's these interesting juxtapositions all throughout the book that are, you know, one sentence and then it's absolute polar opposite.
But I think a lot of this is the common mindset of the ancient world. And you know, where God comes into it, actually, is God is the limit of what humans can do. And therefore, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And when they said fear, they meant fear.
Right.
You know, you'll often get this translated as reverence or something like that, but they meant fear. There is, if you put your head up too high, somebody is going to cut it off. The great sin in Greek tragedy is hybris, the person who tries to rise above his station. That's also what you have in the story of Adam and Eve.
Tower of Babel.
A Tower of Babel. Anybody who tries too much. So it's very un-American literature.
Yeah. It also, on the other hand, I think it does have some American qualities, at least part of it, which is one of the things that Proverbs seems to really hold consistently throughout is if you do the right thing, you will be rewarded. And when you see somebody who has been rewarded, you can assume they did the right thing, right? Health and wealth and happiness are all contingent on behavior. There's sort of semi-famously, Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, has a tendency to tweet a verse from Proverbs every day. And at one point, I wrote a piece where I said, this doesn't surprise me because I think Proverbs is the most Republican book of the Bible. Right? Because it has that particular, you know, that notion of, you know, if you are, you know, the healthy are healthy because they're better.
Yeah.
Right? Because they are sort of morally superior, and wealth comes to those who act rightly.
This is the prosperity gospel before its time.
I think that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Now, the underlying idea of it is that there is a chain of act and consequence.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the alternative is that the world is just random. Now,
you mean the alternative is the book of Ecclesiastes?
The alternative philosophy, well, yes, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
But they want to find order in the world. This is really where wisdom, so-called, lies, is discerning that order. And so they're constantly saying things like, he who digs a pit will fall into it.
Right.
You know, one thing follows from another. No smoke without a fire.
And that's true to a certain extent.
Yes.
Right? So, which is why so much of Proverbs and wisdom literature generally really seems to be about theodicy. Right? Really seems to be about you know, good things happening to good people and bad things happening to bad people, or not. But Proverbs really wants that to be the case.
Proverbs, yes, because, you know, there is one strand of material in Proverbs that I would say is kind of hard-nosed observation of reality. So, if you do X, if you go surety for another, you could lose your bed. Then there's another strand that keeps telling you what they want to believe. And that is, God will not let the righteous go hungry. That no matter what, God will reward good behavior. Now, that's nice inspirational literature, perhaps, for the young.
Right, but it makes bad public policy.
It makes bad public policy, and in the end, it makes bad theology.
Yeah.
Because it leads to the assumption that you know how things are going to work out, and that you can then read backwards, so that if you end up wealthy, then you must have been doing something right. That's the idea of it, I think. Now, every now and then you will get a qualification on that, like, don't boast about tomorrow. Nobody knows what tomorrow will bring. But there is a strand in the book of Proverbs that kind of forgets that.
Right. When you bring that up, it reminds me of the fact that Proverbs is very much sort of present-oriented. Right? It's not like prophecy that sort of looks ahead to the future, and it has virtually zero sense of past. Right? They don't look to the past for lessons. Right.
Well, they will look a little bit to the tradition
like
of
your
the fathers.
Parents, right?
Exactly.
Your parents, but
what
not
your parents told you.
But not Israel's history.
Not
right?
Israel's history.
Is never as opposed to, again, there are plenty of books, the prophetic books, the Deuteronomy, that say, look at how it was for you, Israel, in generations past. Therefore, here's how you should act. This is very much, yes, you can see it within your lifetime. I think you can see your parents and learn from it.
Yeah. In theory, it seems to me that Proverbs is claiming that everything it says is grounded in observation. In fact, what it's grounded in is tradition hardened into dogma, at least a good deal of the time.
Yeah, it's. I have to say, I find Proverbs difficult at times, not just because it's a list and it becomes deadly boring, but because it seems not to actually coincide with reality, despite the fact that it is ostensibly sort of using reality to draw lessons. It's the same sort of. It's the same sort of thing. Our sort of proverbial stories about the tortoise and the hare, or the whatever, the one with the ants, and all of those that are sort of anecdotal, and if you can draw interesting lessons from them. But if you turn it into a worldview, it's just not. It's not quite accurate.
And it seems to me that you can really discern two different strata in the book. Especially in the section that's attributed to the men of Hezekiah, you get a lot of these observations. Like the lazy man, a door turns on its hinges, so does a lazy person turn in bed. All, kind of witty, droll. But then somebody came along and said, this isn't edifying enough. So the righteousness of the upright saves them, but the treacherous are taken captive by their schemes. When the wicked die, their hope perishes, and the expectation of the godless comes to nothing. Well, of course, in the worldview of Proverbs, when the righteous die, their hope perishes too.
Right.
But they dress it up this way to put a veneer of piety on it.
And to be fair, this is sort of how parents talk to children, at least when they're young.
Yeah.
Right. Proverbs is like wisdom literature for kids. Whereas I might say that Ecclesiastes is wisdom literature for the older crowd, but we will get there. But it does feel like it's Proverbs lays a groundwork of what we think of today as sort of the essence of wisdom literature. Right? It's these kinds of plain statements that are, you said, sententious, or they're a little bit dull and a little bit moralistic. And you have to have those so that we can all react against them. And so the other biblical books, Ecclesiastes and Job, I think, are sort of reactions to this kind of stuff. But it's good to have it all in one place. we didn't really touch on chapters 1 through 9 or the end.
We'll get to those now.
We're going to turn to those next.
Yes.